All right, let's start back up. So we're going to kind of shift topics a little bit to talk about disinformation. And I wanted to talk about it because I think it's one of the kind of big risks of more accurate NLP, and something that we kind of see from getting better language models. And it's also an issue that shows up across kind of a range of tech products and interest. And so I think kind of at many of your jobs, some of these issues will be relevant. And it's also something we really need to be thinking about kind of as data scientists and also as a society more broadly. So briefly, disinformation kind of covers this overlap between falseness and intent to harm. This is a graph from Claire Wardle, who studies disinformation, and she defines kind of misinformation as unintentional mistakes. Malinformation is, say, deliberate publication of private info, and disinfo is kind of the intersection of those two, fabricated or deliberately manipulated audio or visual content, intentionally creating conspiracy theories or rumors. This is all kind of example of disinformation. And we'll see kind of more examples as we go through this. So, whoops. Okay, there's supposed to be an animation there. This is 2 years ago, the FCC was considering repealing net neutrality, and they solicited comments from kind of US citizens to get their opinion, and they got over 22 million comments, and most of those comments, I think, said that they were for repeal. And some of the comments read things: Americans, as opposed to Washington bureaucrats, deserve to enjoy the services they desire. Individual citizens, as opposed to Washington bureaucrats, should be able to select whichever services they desire. People like me, as opposed to so-called experts, should be free to buy whatever products they choose. And so these are sounding a bit formulaic, right? And so Jeff Cow, a data scientist who now works as a computational journalist at ProPublica, did a really interesting analysis. I mean, you should definitely read his post on this. And he found that less than 4% of the comments that had been submitted were unique, which is, I think, a really kind of disturbing number. And some of these may have come from kind of campaigns of people sending stuff. They're not necessarily all spam, but he did identify a few kind of pro-repeal spam campaigns. The image here came from one in particular that seemed to use a mail merge style, kind of like Mad Libs of plugging in different choices for, you know, Americans or citizens, as opposed to Washington bureaucrats, kind of plugging these in. And so he did this analysis and found that there were 1.3 million comments fitting that Mad Lib style pattern. And it's likely that more than 99% of the truly unique comments wanted to keep net neutrality, which is different than, you know, if you include these millions and millions of pro-repeal comments that seemed very formulaic and spammy. And so this great investigative work by Jeff Cow, something to remember is that this was in 2017, and the technology for language modeling has vastly improved since then. And there's a huge difference in what's possible in 2019 versus 2017. And I think that the spam comments and the kind of manipulative comments could be a lot more compelling today and a lot harder to spot. So just to remind you, OpenAI's GPT-2 came out earlier this year. And I'm sorry, I know we read this unicorn story before, but I want to read it again just because it's so compelling. So this is a language model. It was given a prompt about scientists discovering a herd of unicorns in the Andes Mountains. And what the computer wrote is, Dr. Jorge Perez, an evolutionary biologist from the University of La Paz, and several companions were exploring the Andes Mountains when they found a small valley with no other animals or humans. Perez noticed that the valley had what appeared to be a natural fountain surrounded by two peaks of rock and silver snow. Perez and the others ventured further into the valley. By the time we reached the top of one peak, the water looked blue with some crystals on top, said Perez. Perez and his friends were astonished to see the unicorn herd. These creatures could be seen from the air without having to move too much to see them. They were so close they could touch their horns. This is very compelling prose to have been written by a computer. And so it's something that we need to kind of be, I think, concerned about this capability and how it can be used for disinformation. And so I'll kind of just, I think about that FCC campaign, and that I think it would be much, much harder to spot the spam campaigns if it was using a technology like GPT-2 today. And we'll kind of come back to this and talk about OpenAI did not release the full model because they were trying to highlight the risk, and this was a very controversial decision within the machine learning community. And so I'll touch on that in a little bit. But first, I want to talk kind of about some of the other risks that this could take. And I think, so I'll say kind of this risk of showing the FCC campaign is that humans may end up having to compete with spam or bots for legislature attention to kind of raise concerns or to say what their opinions on concerns are. Another area of worry is how online conversations and chat rooms and kind of social media, which have a positive side, also have a negative side of how they can influence our beliefs. Humans are very social, and even though I think kind of we all like to think that we're independent thinkers, that definitely like the beliefs of particularly people we consider kind of part of our group or consider being like-minded do influence our views and our beliefs. And so there's kind of already an issue with real people of radicalization happening on the internet. And so this has been seen with, there was a shooting in November at a Pittsburgh synagogue, and the shooter was someone who's very kind of anti-Semitic. He was very active on the social networking site Gab. He even posted kind of directly before committing the shooting and murdering 11 people. But that was at least played some sort of role in kind of his radicalization and how he expressed it. Then there was a mass murder at two mosques in New Zealand earlier this year. 50 people were killed by a white supremacist. And he tried to stream the attack with videos. He released a lot of information on different social networking sites. The New York Times described it as a mass murder of and for the internet. The attacker kind of, they wrote in the New York Times, the attack was teased on Twitter. It was announced on 8chan, broadcast live on Facebook. The footage was then replayed endlessly on YouTube, Twitter, and Reddit. And the networks were all trying to take down the videos of the footage, but there were just so many copies of it. It kept being reposted. People on 8chan discussed it, and many wrote that they celebrated the attacks and found them inspiring and wanted to commit murder as well. And so this is really kind of concerning, this like radicalization that is happening via the internet. It's not, and it's international. There was a trial for a gang rape in Spain, and it was mishandled in a number of ways, and this really galvanized a lot of feminists in Spain to protest, but it also galvanized a backlash of kind of misogyny and support for the rapist. And a lot of this happened in an online forum that had started as a car forum, but a lot of people kind of organized and expressed very extreme views on it. And there's been like this huge kind of increase in the far right party in Spain. They now, I think they hold 10% of the government or congressional positions, whereas just a few years ago it was less than 1%. And so extreme viewpoints can be normalized when we think we're around others who hold those views. And so that's like already happening with real people. But if we think about the potential for computer-generated language to contribute to that, that we can have bots and kind of manipulative campaigns will be able to more easily contribute to that. And so you may think a bunch of people hold a view, and they may not even be real people in the future. So there's a lot of potential for bad actors to kind of manipulate public discussion and manipulate viewpoints. So this is Reddit's a place where a lot of people discuss things. So here, this is a discussion about whether the US should cut defense spending. You've got responses, you're wrong. The defense budget is a good example of how badly the US spends money on the military. Someone replies, yeah, but that's already happening. There's a huge increase in the military budget. The Pentagon budget's already increasing. Someone else says, I didn't mean to sound like stop paying for the military. I'm not saying that we cannot pay the bills, but I think it would make sense to cut defense spending. Does anyone want to guess what subreddit this was on? So this is actually on a GPT-2 subreddit. So these comments are all written by GPT-2. And so this, I covered that up. And they're like, if you read them, like you can catch that they're off, but they're pretty convincing, I think, on first pass. And you can see that they're pretty good. And this is something like, this is, I think, totally fine. Like people know this is GPT-2, and this was actually, all the comments are by GPT-2 responding to itself. But if you just think of the potential of, particularly as the technology advances, for using this in other forums, of expressing positions and kind of arguing for certain points, what the potential will be when kind of computers can do this, and particularly computers operated by actors that are trying to push certain viewpoints or manipulate public opinion. And so, yeah, I thought that was, and you can check out the GP2 subreddit. There's also another subreddit that's specifically, I think it's more Markov chain models, but is only bots. And at this point, like some of them, you can tell, like, okay, this is clearly a bot, but the technology is really improving, and this is something that does have a lot of potential to kind of sway opinion and also sway our perceptions of what normal and valid opinions are, of what a lot of people think. Or, you know, what we think what we think are people, they may be bots. So that's, and I kind of want to put that as a separate category from fake news. So it's related to fake news, but I think it's a kind of separate area of concern that we should be alarmed about, that I'd like to see kind of getting more attention. So on the topic of fake news, disinformation spread via WhatsApp is thought to have played a pretty large role in the Brazilian election. I can't remember if it was October or November, Brazil elected a far-right president who's kind of known for being misogynistic and racist. He's also kind of anti-conservation and has gotten rid of the departments that were addressing climate change and trying to stop deforestation of the Amazon. So it's pretty alarming that he was elected, and a lot of people raised concerns ahead of the election about how WhatsApp was being used to spread disinformation. There was one study that took a sample of more than 100,000 political images and found that 56% of the most shared images were misleading, and only 8% of the 50 most widely shared images on WhatsApp were considered fully truthful. So that's very worrying, kind of this spread of misinformation that's kind of happened around the world and has influenced politics around the world. In India, there's been a string of killings linked to messages spread on WhatsApp. And as a reminder, WhatsApp is owned by Facebook. One Indian data journalism outlet thinks that 33 people have been murdered in 69 incidences of mob violence between January 2017 and July 2018. And this is something where I think many of the cases, there'll be kind of totally fabricated news of, you know, a child kidnapper is coming around, and so then strangers come into a small town and a mob murders them. And this has, it's obviously terrible for the person and their loved ones who was murdered, but it also, you know, the murderers end up in jail. Many of them were acting on totally false information. It's been really destructive. In Texas, in 2016, there was a protest announced by a group called the Heart of Texas to protest outside an Islamic center. So a lot of people showed up. There was also a counter-protest organized via Facebook. And journalists who covered it noticed something odd, that none of the leaders from the protest nor the counter-protest were there, and they were not able to get in touch with them. This was also the protest. There was a lot of encouragement to bring guns and to show up armed. Many people did. There were also like bomb threats. And it turns out both sides were organized by Russian trolls. This was discovered later, and this is just an example of, and so here this is not NLP or machine learning, but kind of showing the impact that Russian trolls or kind of other state actors, or even just bad actors in general, can have on the real world. Kind of what happens online is not just online, and we saw this with the mention of the kind of white supremacist shootings at a synagogue or at mosque earlier, but they can really have a real world impact. And so this is something that, say, is already an issue that I think technology is going to be able to make worse and more dangerous. New Knowledge conducted a review of Russian social media use between 2015 and 2017. And they concluded that Russians weren't just running a bland content farm, turning out propaganda in broken English. The operation was deeply sophisticated and at times downright funny. As the report's authors note, the IRA, which is the Internet Research Agency, which is a Russian group, is fluent in American trolling culture. They found that the troll accounts received 187 million engagements on Instagram, and about 40% of the accounts they created had at least 10,000 followers. So this is something that, and then 1.4 million people engaged with their tweets, leading to nearly 73 million engagements. So this is something that's already kind of having an impact, again, even when it's just humans doing this. And so just thinking about the potential for technology to scale this up even further, both in the kind of the volume and also the impact. It's also worth noting Russian trolls have promoted anti-vaxxer propaganda, both in the US and Europe, and have kind of played a rise in the kind of reduced vaccination rates. That again have had a real-world impact of more people getting sick and even dying of preventable illnesses due to misinformation and disinformation. And I think this example of anti-vaxxing also highlights that with many of these, it's a movement can be a mix of, you know, genuine people who sincerely believe what they're saying, as well as state actors, as well as trolls. That's often not a clean divide between, you know, this is kind of what real people are saying versus a troll or a state actor. And then, and I'll quote more from this post later. So Renee DiResta is, I think, one of the foremost experts in this area of kind of computational propaganda. And she and Mike Godwin wrote an article that I'll show the link to in a bit on just security, but framing, and Mike Godwin was kind of the original lawyer for the EFF, or original legal counsel, but disinformation is a cybersecurity problem. And so kind of thinking about this framing of it as a cybersecurity problem, and that often it's not just what the content is, but kind of recognizing what are manipulative and kind of false campaigns that are not happening organically. The Associated Press wrote a story just a week or two ago breaking that Katie Jones, who's listed as a Russia and Eurasia Fellow at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, she was connected to a number of kind of policy institutes across the political spectrum in Washington, and they found that she's not an actual person. This is just a GAN-generated photo. And you can see, and I'm not saying that her photo comes from this website, but you can see the website, this person does not exist, which shows photos of not real people that look very compelling. And you can think about kind of how this can be combined. I think it's important to think about the ways that fake visuals, fake audio, fake videos, and fake text will be able to kind of be combined to create compelling personas or social media profiles. Again, none of these are real people. So when OpenAI released GPT-2, the language model that wrote the unicorn story in February, and they did not release the weights or the full model in their paper. There was an article on it. Jeremy was quoted in The Verge. We have the technology to totally fill Twitter, email, and the web up with reasonable sounding, context-appropriate prose, which would drown out all other speech and be impossible to filter. So I think that's very scary and a good articulation of kind of the risk we're facing. So this is from the OpenAI GPT-2 paper. And so they used kind of two components, something called staged release. So they announced the results and said, and a smaller version of the model, and said, we'll release more of the model later. But they were trying to kind of raise awareness of the risk, as well as partnership-based sharing. So kind of people that were working on research around addressing these risks could have access to the model through partnerships with them. And this was really controversial in the machine learning community. And actually, let me check who here heard about kind of the controversy of when this happened. And there are definitely, I think, things that I wish they had done differently. On the whole, I think it's good that they were raising awareness of their risk. Jeremy wrote a post about this at the time, some thoughts on zero-day threats in AI and OpenAI's GPT-2 for the Fast AI blog. And I think he articulated what some of the, so I saw within the machine learning community, there was a lot of kind of negativity and snark around them not releasing the model. And a lot of people saw this as a kind of a PR stunt. And I think some of that came from the fact that academic publishing has very different kind of motives and incentives than broader community interest. And so GPT-2 is actually not a novel technology. It's kind of just a bigger version of something the same authors had already done, and it's very in line with a lot of techniques that are being used by many different groups. And so I think a lot of people kind of saw the PR as like, this isn't a huge technical innovation in terms of the algorithm, kind of why is there so much PR about this, this is obnoxious, and kind of not recognizing that academic novelty is different from kind of societal impact, surprise, narrative, kind of issues that lead to community impact. I will say, so I really appreciate them raising the risk about this. I do wish they had put more emphasis and been more open on how they made their decision around release, because I think that information is important and should help. Like to me, the ideal would be for kind of the field of machine learning to develop norms about how we raise dual risk and how we research those things. And so I would have liked to see, I think, more openness around that. And I do see how they, I think, could have included more people in a way to maybe short circuit some of the claims they're just doing it for PR. But on the whole, I do think that the model presents risk, and I'm glad they took those seriously. And I'll take a moment if anyone else wants to comment on kind of their thoughts on GPT-2, or even just questions of what I've talked about so far. Let me turn up the volume.
So it definitely seems quite clear that this is very scary technology. I'm curious what specific branch of deep learning is now trying to address this specific problem? I maybe discriminating between real text and generated text, or if that's even possible, because the Reddit comments had me fooled.
Yeah. Yeah, so I'll talk later on. So there are people working on this. There was a workshop at ICML on detecting fakes. And I don't know that there's even kind of a specific name for people working on this. I think that's valuable work, but I do, and I'll say more about this in a moment, I think given the nature of kind of how if you have a discriminator and a generator, you can always use your discriminator to make your generator better. I think that will always be an arms race, and so I don't think this is something that will be solved solely through technology. But yeah, that's a good question. Any other questions or comments about this so far? Yeah, I'll talk about some steps towards solutions towards the end, although these are really difficult problems, and so it's not kind of not going to be like, this is how you solve it. Was that a hand?
Oh, yeah.
Oh, let me. Oh, sorry. Sorry. Good catch. Bad throw on my part.
So yeah, I have two questions. One of them, I mean, when we're talking about machine learning ethics, I think is maybe two classes ago. And one thing that you kind of brought up is, does this need to be done at all? In context of GPT-2, did it need to be even, I mean, if it is supposedly so dangerous, there is a certain point where you have to ask if this research is actually that necessary. And then I have another question, if you think that there will be a point where machines are being trained in machine language or machine generated language, where if there's like a flattening of language on the internet where everyone is talking like machines.
Okay. Yeah. So for the first question, that's a good question about does this need to be done. I think in the case of GPT-2, because it didn't have any kind of new algorithmic breakthroughs, it is something that particularly like well-funded state actors could already have been doing. And so I think it had value in showing what's possible. So this is something Jeremy has been alarmed about for a while, and last year even tried to talk to several journalists about it, and kind of without a concrete illustration of like showing exactly like this is what is possible, it was harder, like nobody wanted to cover the story. It's not really a story till there's an illustration. So in that sense, I think it has value. But you're right, I do think like the question of should this be done, yeah, I would have concerns about, like, I think people should ask, like, yeah, do we want to be doing research on totally novel ways to make even more compelling fake text? Yeah, that does seem harmful. On the question about, I think you're kind of asking, like, will machine text kind of take over to an extent that it's more important than human text, or like it kind of sets the norm for how speech is, and so then that's what we'll be researching or studying?
Well, I mean, so kind of that article that I said too, I mean, there's this kind of concern where if the internet and if humans are social and we are taking cues from what we're reading online, if there's going to be more and more standardization of language.
Yeah, so to repeat for the microphone, the question of kind of will there be more and more standardization of language online? Yeah, that's an interesting question. I don't know that I have a sense of kind of which direction that will go in. It does, I mean, I feel like to me it feels urgent that we need to do something to kind of prioritize humans. Like I feel like online human language should have more value than something generated from a bot. But again, it's not often not going to be clear, the difference. All right, let me continue. But yeah, these are good questions. Yeah, and I have to say with a lot of this, I feel like I don't necessarily have answers about it because there's some pretty hard problems. So this is a report that came out last year on the malicious use of AI, forecasting, prevention, and mitigation. Miles Brundage was the lead author on this. He was at the University of Oxford at the time, but is now at OpenAI working on policy. And this, I think 26 people worked on this report from 14 different institutions. And they put out a few recommendations that policymakers and tech researchers should collaborate closely. AI engineers and researchers should take dual-use nature of our work seriously. Best practices around dual use should be imported from other areas, such as computer security, where relevant. And to be clear, dual use is when something has both positive uses as well as malicious uses. And expand the range of stakeholders and domain experts involved in these discussions. And so I do think this is somewhat what OpenAI was trying to do with GPT, or how they partially released GPT-2. This is also an area where I would like to see kind of more concrete guidelines and more kind of concrete sharing. Oh, Jeremy?
There was an interesting example on Twitter in the last 2 weeks where a student had got Google has this research program where you can get access to TPUs for free to do research, and he used the research program at Google to train the full version of GPT-2 himself. And he got onto Twitter and said, well, OpenAI didn't do it, but I'm doing it, so I'm going to release GPT-2 tomorrow. And it was interesting, he ended up not doing it after talking to lots and lots of people, and the thing he said he found most compelling was somebody who pointed out that not taking the idea of responsible disclosure seriously means that the next time somebody is worried about responsible disclosure, they may disclose anyway because they're more worried about being looked at than
yeah.
Yeah,
and I think they've been calling that like a race to the bottom on the issue of
So kind of just there's this basic idea that even if you don't agree with the specific decision of somebody around responsible disclosure, it's important to engage with it in a respectful way and make that part of the machine learning culture.
Thank you, Jeremy. That's a great point. And that is something that I feel like is just very new to the machine learning culture, which has had a very kind of valuing openness, and there are many ways in which openness is good for kind of accessibility. And so this is very new and is kind of going against many cultural norms. Another point that's been talked about a lot with in context of GPT-2 is kind of the asymmetry of the decision. Like you can always decide to, they can always change their mind and decide to release it later. But if they release it, they cannot change their mind and take it back once it's out there. And so that there's a real kind of asymmetry around the decision to release, and that in that context also the decision to wait in some ways is safer because, they can change their mind in a month as opposed to once they release, it's out there. And that also, the student Jeremy was talking about that initially said he was going to release it and then changed his mind, he did write blog post about both. He kind of had written an initial blog post, saying like, I've reproduced this and I plan to release it. And a lot of people responded, and there were a lot of kind of interesting Twitter discussions on this. And then he did write kind of another blog post of like, this is why I've updated my beliefs and I'm not going to release it now. But yeah, so just to kind of raise the concern that online discussion in the future will be swamped with fake manipulative agents, even more so than it is now, and that this is potentially quite harmful. The next topic I wanted to get into is deep fakes, and so these are compelling fake videos that can be made, and the technology is really improved around this. And this involves a mix of video as well as audio. Drew Harwell for the Washington Post has written some good stories on this. He's highlighted that right now these are primarily being used to harass women. And I was on a NPR show about this last week, together with Jack Clark and Danielle Citron. And Jack Clark of OpenAI shared research, I think from Deep Trace, that basically like 95% of deep fakes, these fake videos on the web, are for misogynistic harassment right now. So kind of creating fake porn videos and putting women's faces that they've copied from other photos into them. And this can have, very negative impact, and it's been used against high school students. There's a journalist who was exposing corruption, a female journalist in India, and this has been used to harass her and has had a really kind of negative impact. So this is a concern, and then Drew Harwell kind of wrote more recently on deepfake. So this is something that is already, I would say, causing a lot of harm in the terms of harassment and will probably get worse. And, and these can also be used to try to blackmail women or to threaten their jobs of, I'm going to send this to your boss. So this is the NPR podcast I was on last week. It's called 1A. And I thought it was a really good discussion. Jack Clark is policy director at OpenAI. Danielle Citrin is a law professor. And if we actually may not have time, I'll link to a clip of her. She and Jack both testified before congressional committee, I guess 2 weeks ago on this topic. But it was an interesting discussion about kind of some of the risk. And I want to highlight a few kind of nuanced points around deep fakes. So one is that people often respond to media that confirms their pre-existing beliefs. So it's not always about truth, and it's not always about something being kind of, is this like super compelling and does it check out with fact checks, but more about kind of like what are our pre-existing beliefs. There was and it actually did not use deep learning, but there was a fake video of Nancy Pelosi that was created a few weeks ago and viewed, I think, millions of times that had been altered to make it seem like she was drunk or impaired. And, a lot of that sharing may have just come from people that don't like Nancy Pelosi. And so the video appealed to them in that sense, so kind of apart from, whether it was compelling or not. Many more people will see the incendiary false version of a story than the fact-checked correct version that goes out later. And this has been shown in research studies that kind of the incendiary false version gets way, way more views than a fact-checked version later. So there's a very kind of like unfortunate asymmetry there about who sees false information. The goal of some disinformation and propaganda is not necessarily to convince, but to get people to give up on seeking facts, which is also very, very harmful, I think, to society, for people to give up on the facts or feel like they can't know the facts. And then a term called the liar's dividend that Danielle Citrin and Robert Chesney came up with is that, so it's important to raise awareness about deep fakes so people know not to trust kind of every video they see. But then there's also this idea that bad actors can now deny authentic videos that are capturing kind of their bad actions by saying that they're fake. And Donald Trump has already attempted this multiple times, kind of most notably for the Hollywood Access video. He even apologized and admitted about it. This is a video where he said he likes to sexually assault women. He apologized, and then he later has claimed that it was fake and that it was altered. So that's kind of a downside to raising awareness of fake videos, is also let people know that kind of bad actors can use this to try to get off the hook. A variation on that Zeynep Tufekci talks about, and she's another kind of leading expert in this area. She wrote in Wired, when I talk to dissidents around the world, they rarely ask me how they can post information anonymously, but do often ask me how to authenticate the information they post. Dissidents can end up putting their lives on the line to post a picture documenting wrongdoing, only to be faced with an endless stream of deliberately misleading claims that the picture was taken 10 years ago, that it's from somewhere else, that it's been doctored. And Zeynep definitely supports the need for people to be able to post anonymously and the kind of need, particularly for stable anonymous pseudonyms. But I thought this was a very interesting point about how I think this is kind of the liar's dividend could be weaponized against dissidents who are trying to raise awareness of bad action. And we'll come back to this article because in it, Zeynep proposes kind of verification as a key need for addressing this. There's this idea of censorship via information glut. Anne Applebaum wrote in the Washington Post, do you still believe that some old-fashioned Orwellian form of censorship is the main threat to free speech? Think again, the new censors won't remove your words, they'll drown them out, just because there is kind of so much text to parse through on the web. Renee DiResta has spoken about this. She referred to flooding the zone with BS as a kind of social DDoS, which is stands for distributed denial of service, but kind of attacking people with just through kind of so much information. And the phrase flooding the zone with flooding the zone with shit comes from Steve Bannon describing his media strategy of kind of just kind of putting so much kind of negative stuff out there that it can be overwhelming. Zeynep has tweeted and written, "It's no longer the age of information scarcity. Censorship works by info glut, distraction, confusion, and stealing political focus and attention." So the kind of another component of this that really relates is the way that recommendation systems can amplify and incentivize disinformation. So this is something where I think the way recommendation systems operate currently is going to cause a lot of disinformation and fake information to kind of be heavily promoted and kind of put even more attention on it, which is a bad thing. So YouTube in 2017 wrote a post, you know what's cool, 1 billion hours. Once people were watching 1 billion hours of YouTube per day, that's now up to 5 billion hours per day of YouTube being watched. And then 2018, YouTube's chief product officer said that 70% of what is watched on YouTube comes from YouTube's recommendation system. And so this is the sidebar that says up next, and the top video starts auto-playing as soon as your video's done. So 70% of the YouTube watched is videos being selected and auto-played by YouTube without the viewer even having to click anything, right? And this gives YouTube kind of a huge amount of power over what is seen and what gets popular. Unfortunately, YouTube has been shown through kind of research and reporting to disproportionately promote conspiracy theories, including anti-vaxxing, denying that mass shootings have taken place, denying climate science. Bloomberg had a really well-researched expose where they talked to 20 current and former YouTube employees about the ways that investigating disinformation and conspiracy theories were totally discouraged and kind of squelched at YouTube. This was a problem that they did not want to address. 5 executives have left Google or YouTube. Google owns YouTube, have privately cited YouTube's kind of inability and unwillingness to address toxic videos as a reason. Zeynep Tufekci wrote in the New York Times, YouTube may be the most powerful radicalizing instrument of the 21st century. Guillaume Chazlot is kind of the YouTube whistleblower. He has a PhD in AI. He previously worked at Google and YouTube on their recommendation system several years ago, and he's written about the kind of the mechanism of how by designing an algorithm to maximize watch time, that's going to end up incentivizing content that says the rest of the media is lying, because then you spend less time on other media sources and more time on YouTube. And he's done a lot of quantitative research on what YouTube recommends. And so this this is, kind of more about how it promotes white supremacy. Guillaume Chazlot said that Alex Jones videos were recommended more than 15 billion times by the YouTube recommendation algorithm. This is something, it's really important to kind of distinguish between hosting content and promoting content. This is not people looking up Alex Jones videos. This is YouTube kind of shoving them in the faces of people that were not even looking for them. And just, if you're not familiar, Alex Jones is the most prolific conspiracy theorist of the 21st century, according to the Southern Poverty Law Center. But he, kind of one of his conspiracy theories was to say that the Sandy Hook elementary school shooting did not take place. And his kind of videos and theory around this led to this years-long harassment case against many of the parents whose children were murdered. And so there are parents whose children were murdered. People are claiming this shooting didn't take place, and they've had to move houses multiple times to try to evade harassment. So it's just really terrible, and terrible that YouTube would, again, show these videos 15 billion times to people that were not looking for them. And I covered a lot of the kind of history around YouTube and what research has been done. And my post was this Google executive deeply misinformed or lying in the New York Times. And that covers kind of a very misleading interview that a YouTube executive recently had, and as well as I go into a lot of the kind of the history and the research. This is a great graph that Guillaume Cheslot put together. And so he has software he's written that basically kind of opens a browser with no history and then follows the chain of recommendations that he gets on YouTube, and does this at scale to kind of study it quantitatively. And basically, so this graph, the x-axis is showing the number of channels recommending a video. The y-axis is the views, log of the views per video. And you see we have this extreme outlier of Russia Today's take on the Mueller report. And Russia Today is a Russia state-owned media outlet. And basically, it was being recommended from this huge range of channels across the political spectrum. And so this should be concerning that something is off, that you kind of have this outlier of certain videos being recommended so much. And this is something that Russia Today has done very well at, and I think there's kind of reason to believe that they're really studying kind of how to manipulate the algorithm. And then I just think in context that kind of makes it particularly dark, this pushing, having billions of hours watched per day above all else. And this, I'm kind of running out of time. I'll just briefly mention this is not disinformation, but YouTube was found to be basically curating videos for pedophiles of kind of what were innocent home videos taken in which children may not be fully clothed, and YouTube was like creating these playlists. There's a New York Times investigation where it would even kind of often start with like sexy videos of adult women and then get younger and younger women until it's showing people kind of prepubescent children, which is really horrifying. And YouTube told the New York Times reporter that they would not turn off recommendations of videos containing children because it drives too much engagement for them. Which I think says a lot about YouTube's priorities. So this is kind of the link, is that recommendation systems will really amplify disinformation, or already are amplifying disinformation, and this will just continue to be a problem as we deal with even more. So towards solutions, as I mentioned earlier, these are really tough problems. There was a workshop at ICML on detecting audiovisual fakes. A few years ago, there was a fake news challenge of identifying fake news. And I think that's valuable research. However, because you can, if you have a generator, kind of something generating fake news and a discriminator that can identify it, you can always use your discriminator to try to make your fakes even more compelling. So this is always going to be an arms race. And so for that reason, I think we need tech and policy to address this. Oren Etziani, the head of the Allen Institute on AI, wrote a great article in HBR earlier this year, and he talks about the issue AI is poised to make high-fidelity forgery inexpensive and automated, and he proposes that we need digital signatures for authentication as a way to address this. And this will also involve a huge shift, though, in cultural norms. So it's not just the technology to involve digital signatures, but also to get people not trusting media that doesn't have them and trusting media that does. So this is a huge task, but I think it's necessary. Zeynep Tufekci wrote something similar in Wired, only she kind of frames this as verified content, but the need for verification so that people can know what's real. And she kind of gives an analogy with you always hear this as a historical example of like when people would hold up a newspaper with the day's date and take a picture to prove that they were still alive. Fidel Castro did this in 2006 after he had had surgery, and there were kind of all these rumors of, is Fidel Castro still alive? So he posed for a picture with today's newspaper, or that date's newspaper. That's something that already with, I think, Photoshop could be faked. And so we'll need kind of the digital analog for that, of how we do this. Zeynep wrote, this is an inflection point. We need new methods of authentication that do not yet exist. If you have met me in the last few years, you know I've been begging technologists in the anti-censorship space to work on this, not just circumvention. Then I mentioned here's the article by Renee DiResta and Mike Godwin in Just Security, and they really think disinformation should be framed as a cybersecurity problem. And so really looking at kind of manipulative and inorganic patterns of how media is being created and posted. Renee also wrote a great post in Wired just this month making analogies with spam and kind of how spam is now filtered out. We don't even see it in our inboxes unless we want to go into our spam filter, how we need to kind of do something similar with low quality information. And then I guess we're out of time. I just wanted to link to, you can watch this, I'll share the link on C-SPAN. This is a video of Danielle Citrin, a law professor testifying before the House Intelligence Committee on this fact, and she does a really kind of interesting explanation. She talks about Section 230, which is a 1996 law that grants immunity to tech platforms for kind of anything hosted on their sites, and there have been different proposals about how to change this. I know Guillaume Chazlot has suggested that we need separate laws to deal with recommendation systems, so maybe publishers can still have immunity for what they host, but not what they recommend. And Danielle Citrin has a proposal around Section 230. Yeah, and then I just wanted to link to the malicious use of AI report again as another place kind of outlining steps we need to take. So it's 1 o'clock, we're at time. You can stay if you have questions, but I think this issue of disinformation is a huge one, and you can see just from kind of the range of tech companies that were mentioned in this and the types of technologies being used that it's very pervasive, and I think will be relevant in many, many jobs that you may go on to do. Oh, thank you. And the final exam will be Thursday.